Thank you all for being here. This is our last session, our keynote. I'm very, very proud to be able to introduce Carol Browner to the stage here with us to have a kind of a broader view of the energy transition and what's going on, and talk a little bit about the nexus of policy and corporates and how it all comes together. It's those of you who don't know Carol, shame on you. But Carol's senior of counsel at Covington. She's also served as a director of the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy, and she was the longest tenured administrator of the U.S. EPA. Sits on a couple of boards. One maybe we'll touch a little bit on, the chair of League of Conservation Voters, and just really quite distinguished person here. So great to kind of wrap it up and maybe bring all this pieces that we've heard over a course of, I think, a really good day together in a package here for us. So thank you very much for being here.
Certainly.
So you've had a front row seat at some of the most critical climate policy decisions over the years. Given where we are today, do you feel that policy is keeping pace with the urgency of the climate crisis?
The short answer is no, but I think a little bit of history might be helpful. In 1990, the Congress decides to rewrite the Clean Air Act to modernize it. And actually at that time, I'm the legislative director for Al Gore. I'm running his Washington office. And he offers some amendments sort of loosely framed around climate change, but the words climate change, global warming do not appear in the law. So this is 1990. There's some bipartisan support for the amendments he's offering, but the words don't appear. I get to EPA in 1993, and I'm testifying, I think in 94, 95, for our budget, and a rather conservative member asks me, Tom DeLay, some of you may remember him, he ended his career on Dancing with the Stars. Not the usual path for a former member of Congress. And he says to me in this budget hearing, I hear you're regulating climate change or global warming, and I said, well, we're not. We're studying it. We have a lot of scientists, so we're studying it. And he says, well, do you think you can regulate it? And I said, well, that's a good question. I don't know. The words don't appear in the law. So he said, well, go ask your lawyers. And one of them, Gary Guzzi, may actually be here. So he was the general counsel at EPA, and John knows him. And so I asked his predecessor, and then I asked him. And we ended up writing a memo saying that, in fact, if EPA were to find that global warming impacts public health and the environment, not only could EPA regulate it, but would have to. We leave office, and the state of Massachusetts comes along, and they pick up these memos, these legal memos, and they sue my successor at EPA, saying you should be regulating the pollution that causes climate change. And they get all the way to the Supreme Court based on these memos, and the Supreme Court rules 5-4 that yes, even though the words don't appear, if you make a scientific determination that global warming, climate change endanger public health and welfare, EPA must regulate. And then when Obama comes to office, Lisa Jackson, the then head of EPA, makes that determination. So the reason I tell that story is it's not a law that was written about these issues and the challenges of the moment. But to EPA's credit, to President's credits, even I'll give the Supreme Court some limited credit there, we've sort of found this path forward. It would be better, particularly in light of the move in the courts today to really limit EPA's mandate. It would be better if we had more precise and clear instructions about how to do it, when to do it. But without it, those kind of clear instructions, it's sort of the best that we have, and we need to continue to use it to make pace. I'll just add to that what the Biden administration has successfully done is pump all the money in. And so we're engaged in this really interesting experiment. As a former regulator, I was a regulator 8 years at EPA, 2 years before that in the state of Florida, is traditionally we've used sticks. We want you to get rid of your pollution, and so we set a standard, you get a permit, we enforce that permit. Now we're using carrots, right? We're just gonna pay you to try and get to a better place. And it'll be interesting to see if we get better outcomes than we got with sticks. Having said that, we shouldn't get rid of the sticks, because there will be those who will always need that sort of floor to lift them up. So a long story about sort of where we are, but I think it's important because it sort of helps inform what's likely to happen over the next. We're not going to rewrite the Clean Air Act anytime soon. That's not going to happen.
The great story. The money that's coming in from the Biden administration, largely around the IRA, I assume referring to, maybe just thoughts on how is that possibly unwound, or how do you see that go, and potential, not to get, well, I guess we'll go a little bit the political side, and a potential change in administration, either candidate. Would you see that IRA, how does it get adjusted, or you think it's sort of set in stone, or?
Good question. I think, backing up for a second, we have to think about the components of the IRA, broadly speaking. There are the grant programs that they're not just run out of DOE, but the ones that most people are familiar with in this space are run out of DOE, although EPA got $27 billion to fund activity in this space. So there's the grants, right, where you give somebody money to do something. There are the loans where you make a loan and the loan has to be repaid. When I was with Obama, we set up really the first big loan guarantee program, which became famous for Solyndra, which was really unfortunate. The program ended up making money for the U.S. government. I'm not saying Solyndra made it, but it was actually a very successful program. And then there are the tax credits. So you have grants, you have loans, you have tax credits. I think you have to think about them separately. I think when Spencer Abraham, who's someone I actually work with now, was Secretary of Energy, he didn't believe in the loan program. They had a small loan program then, and they weren't doing anything. So I think the loan program is probably the most at risk. Not the loans that have been committed to and made, but whether or not there's more money and they can finish moving all of the money. The grant money, the question will be, is it obligated? So, for example, we represent one of the green banks that got some of the EPA money. We got $5 billion, and that money is now obligated. So it's not just authorized, appropriated, it's obligated. And the case law is pretty good on you can't take back obligated money. It doesn't mean it's in your bank account. It doesn't mean you're free to spend it however you want, but the government, the United States government, has obligated. So money in the grant program that is not obligated, I think, might become fair game in an administration with a different point of view. And then finally, there are the tax credits, and there are many of them, and they're not all of the same ilk, right? And so there's the one for the consumer-facing purchase of electric vehicles, which I can never keep track of whether or not Elon Musk is for or against it on any given day. I'm really not sure. But I think sort of some of the big ones are 45X, which is just about to come out from Treasury. That has broad support across many, many sectors. It's sort of focused on critical minerals and things like that. And so I think some of the tax credits survive. I think the challenge will be if Trump's elected and he wants to do another round of tax cuts, which he says he does, if he feels some obligation or Congress feels some obligation to pay for it, where do they go looking for money? So it's not an easy question to answer. I know that the Biden people, Granholm, et cetera, they are all moving, doing what they need to do, doing their due diligence, dotting their I's, crossing their T's, but they want to obligate as much money as they can. Having said all of that, under sort of any scenario, there will be lots of oversight hearings on how people are spending the money. This will be like a lawyer's gold mine. Lots of people getting called up to testify about whether or not they're doing what they're supposed to do.
Just digging back in, there was a lot of conversation about tax credits while we were here, as you might imagine, and excitement about the ability to deploy capital in the mechanism. But there's still quite a bit of manual processes. So I think they're meant to be make it more fungible and easier for those to occur. And take it a little bit out of the law firms. Do you see progress being made on that?
Yeah, so when I joined Obama in the White House, so we go way back in time, You know, the ITC, the PTC were available. You could, what's the word I want? You couldn't take your credit and get your money from the Treasury Department, so you were always looking for a market. That market sort of collapsed. So we were the first administration to be able to, Treasury does not like to give out money. That's like a really important thing to know. They like to collect money. They don't like to give out money. So we were able to convince them to make it refundable, which was a huge, I think, breakthrough, and really helped, particularly the solar industry, sort of survive a really tough time. So if you're, I think that, I don't think there's any reason to think they won't continue to make tax credits refundable. In terms of like who, I guess what you're really asking is who can get them and what it, I think that is, some of them are clearer than others. And I think that is going to be, getting IRS to weigh in and give clearer guidance is going to be an ongoing challenge. We're involved with some clients looking at 45X, which we don't have a final regulation yet. I've been told probably before the end of the year, maybe before the election. But even then, there's I don't know how many people are following 45X, but the original language and the statute is vague, and then how it's being interpreted. So it's going to be, that will also be a lawyer's.
Yeah. Well, put the shameless plug in for Xpansiv. We would love to help build out some of that infrastructure.
Yeah.
But
I think, having a marketplace like what you guys could do would be huge, to sort of standardizing all of this.
Yeah, I think that's the trick, is how do you standardize it and make it so that it is truly fungible and that people can be comfortable. And it's kind of goes back to maybe even another thing on the voluntary carbon market, which is a small segment of the energy transition. But one of the areas is really how to people get comfortable with what they're buying. There's a lot of nice work around the ICVCM. I was on a panel earlier with Annette Nazareth, who's obviously chair there, VCMI and other groups that are doing lots of stuff there. But is there a role for the U.S. government to help define or give comfort to companies that want to buy something? The SEC's tried to put disclosure laws, and that's obviously gone to court. Any thoughts on how that might evolve?
The SEC did something really interesting. Again, I'll go back to being a former regulator. They put out a final rule. They signed it. And then they obviously got sued. That's like how it works in the regulatory world. And they pulled back their rule and said, we won't implement it while we litigate it. Sort of not really a common strategy. And I think, obviously, the litigation was going to create uncertainty, and maybe there was going to be a stay. But I think, they've created sort of a lot of uncertainty. I don't know. It's a good question. You used to be able to say, well, the government has some general authority, and in that general authority, they can figure out how to maybe be helpful. With the current courts, and this goes from the lower courts all the way up to the Supreme Court, and like basically the Chevron doctrine has been overturned. It's harder and harder for the agencies. Like they're being forced into a smaller and smaller path. And so you might not like what you would get out of a very small path. So it may not, I'd have to think about what laws you might use, but it may not be the best path forward. I think, what you're doing, I think there's a little bit, if you build it, will they come, and can you become the preferred place without the government, sticking its finger in, and then losing in court, and so the uncertainty is even greater than it was originally.
Yeah, we've had to build out and think about the breadth of these markets, so not dependent on any one place for that very reason.
Right. How do you deal with California? Are you just...
Yeah, so well, we deal with California.
I know you're supposed to ask me a question.
Yeah,
I thought I'd ask you one.
No, it's great. California obviously has been a leader in this space. It's a little more complicated regulatory regime than perhaps other states. But there's a number of different areas. So in California, obviously there's the cap and trade program and the ability for us to support that across our infrastructure. But the other pieces are leading in things like LCFS. So low carbon fuel standard, for those that don't know, are programs that are about addressing transportation fuel. And interestingly, the LCFS market is actually bigger than the voluntary carbon market is globally.
Right.
But, so we provide infrastructure to support that as well. So California we've seen as a leader for certain and something as the LCFS is a good example of it, or the carbon cap and trade program. Other areas are trying to replicate or learn from, or let California be on the front end, if you will. So we're very interested in working at the state level, and a lot of what we do is state level, because there's unfortunately not a federal program for a lot of these things. It's important for us to be close with the state, particularly California, but all the states that have programs.
Would you like to see a federal program?
For carbon?
Well, yes.
Yes, so I think I'd be surprised.
So Congress would have to write a law.
Yeah.
Did that scare you?
So I'd be surprised if anybody in this room would say, or any of these rooms, that we shouldn't have, or they wouldn't be good if there was a proper regulated market, right, for these things. So, but there isn't. And I remember. And
would you want the SEC or the FTC?
I'm not going there. We think of it as commodity.
Commodity.
Yeah. So, but and in fact, one of the things we say is it's a commodity, like any other commodity. It has some special features, but it should be regulated and thought of the same way. But if we look at it, the federal cap and trade, or a federal renewable energy market, or a federal any of these things would be fantastic. But we're not quite that delusional at this stage. I don't think it'll happen. So our business is built around the fact that it won't be. But the real question also on that, though, is U.S. leadership around the world. Times it seems like the U.S.'s voice is getting less in this conversation than it has been in the past. And I don't know if that's maybe my view, but I don't know if you have thoughts on that and how the U.S. can get itself. Does the U.S. have a role to help drive the global programs, and how might it happen?
A couple of thoughts. I want to go back for a second. I'll come back to the U.S. Global. When the first thing I did after we got the Green Recovery money in the Recovery Act for Obama, we then focused on Waxman-Markey, obviously the legislation, which became a behemoth. I mean, it became like and I look back at that now and I think, wow, that's not what we should have done. What we should have done is thought about the sectors that contribute to the problem. And they've all been regulated in some way, or the vast majority. Set aside ag for a second. And they're used to different regulatory schemes. So, for example, the power sector was used to cap and trade. That's how we dealt with asset rain. And so what we should have done is sort of come through on a sectoral basis and developed programs that were a continuum, or at least comfortable to the sector, rather than trying to do this sort of industry-wide. Economy-wide. It just in retrospect really didn't work. I think one of the things that, certainly for global companies now, they're dealing with Europe and the CSRD. I mean, there's just so many reporting schemes that are falling, and there's a lack of, they're not unified in sort of how they're thinking of things. And I was talking to a couple of folks I know who are like chief sustainability officers in big public companies, and they were making the point in various ways, but basically the essence of it was we've become compliance offices, right? And so like the smart stuff we were doing, thinking forward, thinking about our SBTs, all of that, we don't have time for anymore because we've got this compliance stuff over here that's fallen on us. And that will, I hope, sort itself out, and systems will come online. We have systems for Sarbanes-Oxley and all of that. But I think it's unfortunate at this moment that we're losing some of the sort of forward-leaning, creative thinking that, so many companies, Microsoft was a great example of what they were doing. I'm not to say that they're not still doing it, but they have this, burden on them. So I think to your point, if there were a way for the U.S. to provide some international leadership, but our problem is we don't even do it, at home. It was so funny when I was at I was at EPA, so it's in the 90s, and you probably don't know this, but the then environment minister of Germany was Angela Merkel. She did much better in her post-environment career than I did. I didn't become president, she became. But she would always attack me in meetings. I mean, she was a lovely woman, but she would attack me in meetings. This cap and trade, it's, you guys are just going to cheat. You guys are for cap and trade, and you're going to use it to sort of cheat and not do it. Of course, then the Europeans embraced it, and we've never embraced it. And so I think, we have constantly struggled in international forums, and in part because, depending on who's in the White House, but we've generally struggled this sense of you're the biggest emitter and you're never doing your fair share. And so even the Europeans can think that about us. I went to Copenhagen with Obama, and that's right after we were still fighting for Waxman Markey. We hadn't lost it, but we'd gotten the Green Recovery Act, which we thought was a lot of money. It was, $70 billion, and then Biden got $400 billion. And it was one of the first times in all these international meetings I'd been to with presidents that we were sort of taken seriously, because we were putting real money and we were fighting for things, and we had set the car standards by then. But I think I ran into John Kerry on the street today, and I was thinking, this man has spent so many years working on these issues, and really, but the progress is just internationally, and it's just so hard.
Slow.
So hard.
Yeah. So one of the, it's easy to look back at time and say, well, everybody was working together, and I'm sure the battle stories you could say about Waxman Markey and a lot of other stuff would say that that's not true. But maybe from your perspective, has the debate, the tenor, I mean, it seems they were sort of screaming at each other. How do we break through that on not the whole world? I'm not going to ask you that, but the climate issues and get alignment so that it becomes less political, perhaps, and more. We've got to solve a problem.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned I chair a nonprofit, and we're the sort of the election arm of the environmental NGOs. We will spend $200 million this election cycle trying to elect people at president, federal, state, local, who are champions of climate change and real progress and real solutions. I've been on and off their board over a 20-year period, and we used to have a very, very bipartisan list of candidates we were supporting. We do have a threshold question. Do you believe climate change is real, and are you committed to doing something? We have no Republicans anymore. I mean, it is a real... When I went to work for Obama in the White House, one of the early phone calls I got was Lindsey Graham, and he said, you know what? I'm going to help you on climate change. So John McCain is still in the Senate, and when Obama and McCain run, we think it's going to be an issue. Those of us in the NGO community, climate change is going to be an issue. And then, early on, McCain goes, "Oh yeah, I think it's real, and we should do something." So suddenly, there's no debate, right? The issue is gone. So Lindsey calls me and says, "I'm going to help you. I want to get something done on this. Let's go to Alaska together." I said, "Well, I'm happy to have your help. I will not be going to Alaska with you. One of the people who work for me will go with you." But those were the kind of calls you would get, and now you don't get those. And I think it is a tribute to a number of things. I'm not giving this in rank order. One is a complete lack of understanding of science. I was testifying when I was at EPA. We set the first ever fine particle standard, and so I've gone up. It's a very controversial air pollution standard, and I've gone up to testify. And a member of the committee says to me in a very authoritative voice, "Well, Miss Browner, I don't know why you're doing this, because I just found out that Harvard is still studying the health effects of fine particles." And you're like, yeah, and guess what? Science, they're going to be studying it forever. And the question for the public policymaker is there enough science? What's the body of evidence to determine? So I think, one, there's a lack of scientific understanding because people, constantly misexplain the science of climate change. Two, I think there are really well-funded forces who don't want the change and don't want to have to make the kind of investments that would solve the problem. And when I worked at the White House, I would give speeches, and I would say, this is with Obama, and I would say, it doesn't really matter what you think about climate change, because there are jobs to be had. Investing in green technologies is good for the economy. And after I left the White House, I realized it does matter what you think. We shouldn't give people a pass on facts. We can give them a pass on whether or not we're going to do something. And I keep thinking we have to be able to get back to a place where the debate is about the solutions as opposed to is there a problem. And we can have debates and we could say, I believe in small modular reactors, SMRs, which I think are, I think we should, I read the other day 3 Mile Island might be opening back up.
That.
Yeah, someone said to me that last night at a dinner, like, that's crazy. I'm like, oh, it's not crazy when you think about climate change. SMRs, carbon capture and storage. If you think about all of those solutions, I think we're at a point now where it's all solutions on the table. Not everyone will agree with every solution, and some may fall off, but that's the conversation we need to be having.
I want to give people an opportunity to ask a couple of questions, and I run out, we could go forever. But one question following up on that, how does this industry, which is broad, I think across the whole energy transition, we have people from project developers to rating agencies, to data companies, to exchanges and market infrastructure operators like us. How do we help the message? Because that seems to me that it's just muddled. That there's a lot of confusion. Any thoughts on how to be effective as an industry?
I think narratives are important, right? It's hard to remember isolated facts, but you can remember a story. You can remember particularly a narrative that is told to you by someone you trust, that's someone you know. And so I think the best narrative we have is there are complex problems and there are solutions. And there are solutions that will be driven not by the regulators, not by the politicians, but by industry. And here's like the 3 things we're doing. I think that is, I think, I used to say when I was at EPA, we set so after we did the fine particle work, then we took, oh God, why am I forgetting this? In diesel fuel, we lowered the sulfur. And I'm like, it's pretty controversial, right? And I'd have to meet with economists who would say, well, only 10% of the engines will need the clean sulfur, so maybe only 10% of the fuel should be clean diesel. I'm like, yeah, but if I'm a trucker, how am I going to figure that out? So I'm never going to buy the clean diesel, so I'm never going to, the truck. And, I realized that helping them understand sort of how these things work became, really important in helping them have sort of a narrative that they could hang on to was important.
Makes sense. Questions? Can't see very well.
We can't see. You can just shout it out. There's one.
Okay, so we're living in a world where there's not going to be any legislation, most likely.
Correct.
Okay. The voluntary markets have not yet scaled. The states have done what the states are going to do for the most part.
Yeah. You might see a little more. Yeah.
And the IRA has been done. So, what is there a world where there's a U.S.-based carbon border adjustment mechanism, either in a Trump administration for deficit reduction reasons / avoiding actual taxes, or in a Kamala administration for both?
Oh wow, that's a big one. I mean, it's hard to imagine Trump doing something called a carbon border adjustment. But having said that, he obviously I'm a Democrat. He said something the other day that I found so odd about how China is paying the tariffs. And you're like, wow, that isn't really the way it works. And so I guess he could see in his mind that somehow or another these border adjustments are not paid by the consumer. But I can't imagine him doing something on carbon. I could see more happening on China, and he said more would happen on China.
He would frame it as American jobs.
Exactly.
Blah, blah, blah.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, and then how you actually determine the measurement that you're going to be taxing, right? Are you, is it the shipping? I mean, there's just so much in what is the carbon associated with that product or that good that would be the subject of lengthy global negotiations, obviously. It's a little bit easier to do the China thing because you just say anything coming from China or you say these types of things coming from China. I could see, I mean, Harris, obviously, believes climate change is real, believes you need to do things, et cetera. Again, it's a tax on the middle class. It's a tax on the working class, and I think that would be very hard for her. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's more likely under Trump.
It won't be called that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I just don't, I think what will be really, I mean, he doesn't have a lot of patience from what I can tell. I don't know the man. Never met him.
Oh, wait.
But, yeah, right. But figuring out what you're taxing. I mean, if you're just going to say, okay, whatever the energy source was and the emissions associated with that source in the manufacturing process, you know, I've been doing some work on ports and, you know, the amount of emissions associated, you know, just near shore, right, as the ships are idling, you know, and bringing their containers in and everything, is huge. Would you include that? Right? Some of that would force changes, right? Because if you're in the shipping industry and, you know, one country is already requiring you and you're in their nearshore waters not to be emitting, and then, you know, the receiving, so the departing country is requiring, and then the receiving country, you know, if you're the shipper, you're probably just going to change your fuel,
Yeah.
right? And that's like a role for the government, right? Because the government could look around the world. There's international agreements on this.
Or you could see a Corsia type.
Corsia,
model.
Corsia is the model.
Yeah,
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Right. Do people know what Corsia is? Yeah.
Other questions? We're at our time, or a little over our time. Anybody? All right, great.
Can I ask the
Yeah,
audience a
yeah,
question?
please.
Just maybe a show of hands. How many people are optimistic that we will find the tools, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word, to address the climate crisis? Nice. I'm there. That's awesome.
I
Thank
think it'll
you.
be a mess to get there, though.
It's going to be really ugly, and our grandchildren will still be working on it. But
Yeah.
yes, well, thank
Yeah.
you guys. That was nice.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh,
It's
certainly.
always great there.
Thank you.
So that
I want to give you guys credit for having the best venue.
yeah.
This is such an awesome hotel.
The people over there can take all the credit for it. So thank you. Thanks for everybody for attending. From our perspective, it's been a great event, and it's all because of all of you and the folks that came up on the panel. Really excited about the week. Thank you all. We have a reception 500 feet down to the left at the consulate. This starts right after this, so please come on over and meet your fellow conference attendees. Thank you.